My name is Ruth Lanning. I'm a retired schoolteacher, and for the past 6 years, I've been volunteering at the Southridge Zoo's Wildlife Rehabilitation and Observation Program. Most of my work has involved birds and reptiles, but in early 2024, I was assigned to a special case, a young male kangaroo named Boomer. At the time, I didn't realize how profoundly this animal would affect me, or how much his story would say about our shifting relationship with the wild. Boomer was born in the Binalong Wildlife Sanctuary, a privately owned parcel of bushland located about 90 minutes outside Sydney. The sanctuary had long served as a refuge for eastern grey kangaroos displaced by land clearing, bushfires, or injured in traffic accidents. Boomer's mother, according to notes provided by the sanctuary's caretakers, had been struck by a vehicle while crossing the Hume Highway at dusk. She survived long enough for local rescuers to find her, but she died 2 days later from internal injuries. At the time, Boomer was barely 10 months old, just young enough to still live in her pouch. He was named Boomer by the staff not just for the traditional term used to describe adult male kangaroos, but also for his unusual spirit. According to Mark Ridley, the sanctuary's lead ecologist, Boomer had a fierceness about him even as a joey. He was often the first to leap toward a feeding trough, the first to bounce through new open spaces, and the last to retreat during rain or wind. Mark described him as a battler, an affectionate Aussie term for someone who perseveres through difficulty. For 3 years, Boomer grew strong among the gum trees and sandstone outcrops of Binalong. The sanctuary was home to a dozen other kangaroos, several wallabies, and a few emus that wandered in from neighboring properties. But over time, the line between neighboring and encroaching became thinner. The land surrounding Binalong had once been grazing pasture. Then came fences, then sheds, then machinery, and finally, noise, the constant grinding and droning of development. Mark told me that in 2023, they received official notification that a commercial housing estate had been approved on the neighboring property, with permission to extend utility corridors into the sanctuary's buffer zone. "It's not safe anymore," he had said plainly, during a phone call with our zoo's conservation team. "We've held off as long as we can." And so the zoo was contacted. A group of us from the Behavioral Health and Animal Transport Division coordinated with the sanctuary to relocate 4 of the more adaptable kangaroos, including Boomer, to our zoo's grassland habitat, an enclosure designed to mimic the open eucalypt savannas of Australia. While many of our animals come from rescues or captive breeding, Boomer was a rare case, a semi-wild animal whose habitat had simply disappeared from beneath his feet. I met him in person for the first time on a gray morning in early March. He'd just arrived in the transport crate, eyes wide and nostrils flaring, still coated in the subtle red dust of Binalong. He wasn't tranquilized. Mark had argued against it, saying it would distress him more than the trip itself, and I could see in his body language that he was wound tight with uncertainty. His forearms trembled, and his tail shifted rapidly, alert and ready to balance should he need to bolt. "He's a thinker, that one," Mark said, standing next to the crate, his own hand resting on the wooden lid. "He watches everything, watches and waits." He was right. Boomer spent the first full day in his new enclosure standing in one spot, just off to the side of the artificial billabong that the zoo had designed to resemble a natural waterhole. From the visitor walkway, he was nearly invisible. But from the staff observation post behind the enclosure, I had a full view of him through a narrow slit in the blind. He barely moved, just stood and listened, muscles tense, ears twitching with every shout, bird call, and rustle of movement. His companions, 2 females named Luma and Tassie, and another male called Jet, were more exploratory. Jet in particular seemed completely at ease, hopping freely and inspecting every tree and log. Luma grazed near the southern fence, occasionally looking over her shoulder at Boomer, then returning to the grass. But Boomer stayed rooted. I wrote in my notebook, "Boomer observes everything. Eats little. Doesn't lie down. Ears tracking, but no aggression." Over the next few weeks, I spent nearly every morning at the enclosure, positioned with a clipboard, a thermos of tea, and a small stool. Zoo policy discouraged over-interaction in the early weeks of an animal's acclimation, so I kept quiet, watched, and took notes. We were monitoring diet, sleep, and social behavior, all key indicators of adaptation stress. Boomer remained aloof for the first week. He didn't interact much with the others. He grazed only after the others had moved off, and only on patches of grass nearest the wire mesh wall, oddly enough, the area closest to foot traffic. Perhaps he took comfort in the noise. But then, on the 12th day, something changed. That morning had brought heavy rain overnight, and the ground was soft underfoot. I arrived early, before the public opening hour, and settled in with my clipboard. The air was thick with mist, and the kangaroos were clustered near the rear rocks, dozing. Then Boomer began to move. At first slowly, but with clear purpose. He hopped past Jet and Luma without engaging them, then paused near a tall clump of native grass. He sniffed the ground, licked his forearm, then, remarkably, lay down. It was the first time I'd seen him do it. Not just crouch, fully recline on his side, back leg stretched out, completely at ease. It was a small moment. To anyone else, perhaps meaningless. But to me, it was the clearest signal I'd seen. He had begun to accept that this was now home. Over the coming days, the changes accumulated. He began feeding with the others, grooming beside the artificial eucalyptus stands, even sparring lightly with Jet, a playful bout of bouncing and chest puffing that ended with a mutual hop away. The visitors loved it, and word began to spread on social media that the kangaroos were full of personality. But none of them saw what I saw, the internal shift of an animal recalibrating his sense of place. Still, there were setbacks. One day in April, a group of schoolchildren on a field trip pressed hard against the viewing glass, banging and shouting. Boomer bolted to the edge of the enclosure and paced for nearly an hour. He refused food that day, and the next. We added new signage, trained the education staff to intercept noisy groups, and made some changes to the landscaping to create better visual barriers. He recovered, but it was a reminder that no matter how naturalistic a zoo habitat might be, it was still a compromise. Through it all, I kept detailed notes, photos, and logs. Not just for the zoo's records, but because I felt that Boomer's journey represented something more than an animal's adaptation. It was a living case study of what displacement is to wildlife when wild space is no longer available. One afternoon, in late May, I stood just beyond the enclosure, leaning on the wooden railing as Boomer and Luma rested beneath a shade tree. An elderly man next to me pointed and said to his granddaughter, "See the one with the thick neck and darker fur? That's the big one, the boss. He looks like he's always lived here." I smiled but said nothing. Because the truth is, he hadn't. He had lived in a place with cicada-thick summers, sandstone ledges, and open, endless sky. A place now lined with surveyor tape and steel stakes. But Boomer had adjusted, not by choice, but by necessity. And in his silent, deliberate way, he had begun to reclaim some semblance of peace. By June, Boomer had settled into a rhythm. It's funny how animals can establish a routine almost without us noticing it. A certain tree they rest under in the early mornings. A loop around the enclosure perimeter at dusk. A preference for which food trough they approach first. In Boomer's case, it became clear he liked the northeast corner of the enclosure, where the slope gave him a slightly higher vantage point and the wind came through just enough to stir the grasses. It reminded me of what Mark Ridley had said when we first met: he watches everything. I continued my volunteer shifts, recording data 4 mornings a week, rotating with 2 other volunteers and the staff zoologist, Priya Menon, who oversaw the grassland exhibit. Priya was brilliant, methodical, sharp-eyed, and passionate about behavioral welfare. She taught me how to recognize not just surface behaviors, but subtle changes in social posture, hierarchy, and emotional state. With her guidance, I learned to read Boomer's tail placement, ear tilt, even how quickly he blinked. "He's adapted better than we expected," she said one day while we were reviewing observation notes in the staff break room. But it's still early. Displacement trauma doesn't always show itself right away. That word, trauma, lingered in my mind. It's not one we typically associate with kangaroos. But once I began looking for it, I saw it everywhere. There was a moment in July when construction began across the road from the zoo, a commercial warehouse site, and the rumble of heavy equipment reached us for the first time. I watched as Boomer stopped mid-hop and stood frozen, head low, ears pinned back, like a statue. It took almost 2 minutes before he resumed movement. Another day, a drone from a news crew buzzed above the tree canopy near the eastern side of the exhibit. Boomer bolted straight into the artificial termite mound near the fence, scraping his flank. It wasn't serious, but the staff filed a full incident report. Despite these moments, he remained the most behaviorally stable of the group. Tassie had developed a pattern of nocturnal pacing. Jet began to display minor over-grooming, chewing at his wrists during the hotter days. Boomer, in contrast, stayed mostly calm, perhaps because he observed more before reacting. His stress didn't present in outward behaviors, it emerged in stillness. In mid-August, we introduced a new enrichment protocol aimed at simulating natural foraging and exploratory behavior. For the kangaroos, this meant spreading native leaf litter over sections of the grassland, burying small amounts of food pellets beneath bark, and installing scent stations with eucalyptus oil and other natural odors. Boomer took to it immediately. Not frantically or curiously like Jet did, but in a deliberate, focused way. He moved from station to station, sniffing, pawing, investigating. "See how he circles back?" Priya noted. "He's checking changes, creating a mental map." By September, visitors had begun to comment on how relaxed the kangaroos seemed, especially the big one, Boomer. I heard one woman refer to him as the patriarch during a docent tour. That made me laugh. He was barely 4 years old, young for a fully mature male, but his size and manner gave him a quiet authority. While Jet bounced into scenes with adolescent energy, Boomer maintained a dignified calm. When Jet occasionally tried to assert himself, posturing with chest puffing or tail thumping, Boomer either ignored him or stepped away, confident he didn't need to prove anything. This restraint, we believed, was part of why the group dynamic stayed stable. In a confined space like the grassland enclosure, dominant males can create tension, especially if they act unpredictably. But Boomer's temperament, patient, observant, quietly dominant, set the tone. And the other kangaroos followed it. Still, that calm didn't mean he wasn't watchful. One morning in early October, I arrived to find Boomer in a different posture than usual. He stood alert in the far eastern section, staring intently through the fence line, body tilted slightly forward. His breathing was shallow, and the others had grouped closer to the center, unusually quiet. I scanned the perimeter and spotted it immediately, an off-leash dog near the staff service road, pacing outside the secondary security fence. It didn't breach the perimeter, but the scent, sound, and movement had been enough to trigger Boomer's alert mode. Even after the dog's owner retrieved it, Boomer remained rigid for more than an hour. He wouldn't graze, wouldn't lie down, wouldn't interact, and that night, for the first time in over a month, he didn't use his usual sleeping spot. Priya and I reviewed the CCTV footage to assess his stress response. We documented the change, adjusted the landscaping near the eastern edge, and added an additional line of tall grasses as a visual barrier. It worked, but only partially. The next few days, Boomer resumed his usual behavior, but his movement patterns had changed slightly, more perimeter walking, more frequent pauses. These were the moments that grounded me in the reality of what we were doing. No matter how carefully constructed the enclosure, it wasn't the wild. It was a curated space, designed for the animal's safety and comfort, yes, but also shaped by the needs of the institution, the visitors, and the city surrounding it. In late October, the zoo hosted an educational event for World Habitat Day. I gave a short talk to a small group of volunteers and visitors about the story of the kangaroos, particularly Boomer. I kept it factual, his background, relocation, adaptation, but as I spoke, I felt something tighten in my chest. For all we'd done to help him, there was still a part of me that felt we were offering a substitute for something irreplaceable. After the talk, a boy, maybe 10 years old, asked me, "Will he ever go back home?" I didn't know what to say. The truth was no. There was no home to return to. Binalong had been subdivided, and the last remaining section of bushland had been cleared to install stormwater infrastructure. The sanctuary itself had been formally dissolved. Mark had retired. The animals that could be relocated were relocated. The rest, I didn't ask. Instead, I said gently, he has a new home now. And we're doing our best to make sure it feels right for him. That night, I stayed later than usual and watched Boomer long after the last visitor had left. He was grazing slowly under the lights that lined the inner path, low, warm glows meant to mimic moonlight. A quiet breeze passed through the enclosure, and I watched him pause, raise his head, and tilt his ears toward the wind. He stood there for a full minute, nose high, as if catching something only he could sense. Then he resumed grazing. I wrote in my journal that night, he doesn't look lost anymore. Just alert. Just aware. In early November, Priya introduced a new initiative, biometric data tracking through contactless observation. Boomer was one of the first candidates. We began using high-resolution infrared cameras during overnight hours to track temperature, movement, and rest cycles. The goal was to better understand how displaced animals physiologically adjust to new environments over time. The data confirmed what we'd suspected: Boomer's sleep patterns had normalized. His core temperature fluctuations showed less variability, and his active hours matched closely with his wild counterparts, suggesting he had fully adapted to the exhibit's light and activity schedule. We were cautiously optimistic. But even with all this progress, I couldn't shake the sense that Boomer lived in a state of dual awareness. He had adapted, yes. He ate, slept, interacted, even played. But he never fully dropped his vigilance. He lived in the now, but with echoes of a past he couldn't quite leave behind. And then came the rain. The first summer storm of the season hit in late November. Heavy sheets of rain swept through the zoo grounds, flooding low areas, including part of the grassland exhibit. The kangaroos huddled near the central shelter, confused and slightly panicked. Boomer, however, did something remarkable. He led, not in a humanized, storybook way, but in a real, observable way. As the rain fell and the others stood disoriented near the trees, Boomer moved calmly toward the rear dry zone, paused, then turned to look back. Slowly, one by one, the others followed. They gathered beneath the overhang, close enough to touch. Boomer stood at the edge of the group, facing outward, tail planted like a tripod, as if guarding the threshold. It was instinctual, maybe. But it felt like something more, a protective act born of memory. Because he had known what it was like to face storms in the open. To survive without barriers or warning systems or staff with emergency plans. That was when I knew. Boomer wasn't just surviving, he had taken ownership of his space. The summer rolled on. By December, the zoo's rhythm had changed: warmer mornings, louder crowds, school holidays in full swing. The heat came early most days, pushing into the mid-30s by late morning, and we adjusted our observation hours accordingly. I began arriving before sunrise, when the air was still cool and the kangaroos were at their most active. Boomer had by then become a central figure of the exhibit, recognizable not just to the staff, but to regular visitors. His photos were featured on educational signage, and the zoo's social media team began referring to him as the guardian of the grasslands. It was more poetic than scientific, but it wasn't inaccurate. Boomer had become the anchor of the group. Every animal in the enclosure had their own personality, their own way of responding to captivity and the limitations it placed on them. Jet remained high energy and restless, often hopping in repetitive circuits. Tassie, a nervous grazer, liked the southern shade zones. Luma, the most social, often stayed close to Boomer. But Boomer stood apart, not by behavior alone, but by presence. He didn't assert dominance aggressively. He didn't demand attention. Yet somehow, wherever he moved, the others oriented around him. And perhaps most importantly, he never forgot how to be wild. I saw this clearly in mid-January, during one of the enrichment drills we ran every fortnight. This one involved scattered foraging bins with new textures, crushed bark, dry leaves, unfamiliar wood chips, buried with small rewards. Jet went straight for the bins, pawing with abandon. Luma hesitated, sniffed, then began to search. But Boomer did something different. He circled the entire perimeter first, nose low, ears flicking, then stood back and watched the others. Only when they were deep into foraging did he approach. Slowly, carefully, without haste. He checked the bins one by one, not for food, it seemed, but for safety. "He's still reading the world like it's a wild place," Priya said, standing beside me. "Even though he's lived in this one for nearly a year." I nodded. "He still thinks like an outsider." And yet, in practice, he had become central, an organizer of calm, a regulator of mood. Whenever a loud sound startled the group, a dropped toolbox from the maintenance path, a balloon popping from a birthday group, Boomer's reaction, or lack of one, often set the tone. If he didn't bolt, the others hesitated less. If he stayed lying down, the moment passed faster. This kind of social signaling is subtle but powerful. And it became a cornerstone of our welfare assessment process. Boomer wasn't just adapting, he was modeling adaptive behavior. But adaptation doesn't erase history. In February, almost a full year after his relocation, Boomer experienced what we believed was a post-traumatic recall. The trigger came from an unexpected source: controlled burns. Every summer, local fire services conduct hazard reduction burns in nearby bushland to prevent larger wildfires. On this particular morning, the wind shifted, carrying a faint but distinct smell of smoke across the zoo. The change in Boomer was instant. He froze in mid-graze, raised his head, and looked toward the southeast. His ears locked in place. His nostrils flared. He didn't bolt, didn't move. But his entire body was taut, coiled. When Luma hopped past him, brushing his side, he flinched visibly. Within the hour, he had moved to the farthest point of the enclosure and remained there, motionless, for the rest of the day. He refused food, didn't respond to the others, didn't lie down. He didn't sleep that night. The staff monitored him closely, as did I. We checked his vitals through remote infrared, analyzed movement patterns, reviewed camera logs. Everything else seemed unchanged. But behaviorally, it took 5 days before he returned to baseline. It reminded us that no matter how calm an animal may appear, their past doesn't just vanish. Especially when it's tied to survival. Still, Boomer recovered. He always did. By the time March came around, the zoo hosted its annual Behind the Habitats Week, a special event designed to let guests learn directly from staff and volunteers. I was invited to give another talk about the kangaroos, this time more in-depth. I hesitated at first. I'm not a biologist, after all, but Priya encouraged me to speak not as a scientist, but as a witness. I told the story of Boomer's relocation, his first days frozen in place, the first time he lay down in the grass. I spoke about his cautious leadership, his trauma responses, his influence on the group. I didn't dramatize it, I didn't need to. The story carried its own quiet weight. After the talk, a woman in her 40s approached me. She said her family had recently moved into a new development on the outskirts of the city, land that, years ago, had been part of the same corridor where Binalong Sanctuary once stood. I didn't know, she said, about the animals. I just didn't think. It wasn't a confession, just a quiet realization. And that's why I keep telling Boomer's story, not to scold, not to guilt, but to make visible what so often goes unseen. The slow, quiet cost of our expansion. The way animals like Boomer lose the ground under their feet, and yet still find a way to stand. Boomer today is doing well. His health metrics remain steady. His interactions with the group are balanced. He has even begun engaging more with Jet, not just play fighting, but lying side by side in the heat of the day, tails overlapping. A sign of mutual trust. We don't use words like happy or content lightly in animal welfare. But what we can say, with confidence, is that Boomer is thriving. He is no longer the still, alert silhouette by the fence line. He is a leader, a stabilizer, a kangaroo who faced the collapse of his world and slowly built something livable from the pieces. On quiet mornings, when the air is soft and the zoo hasn't opened yet, I still come to sit near the enclosure. I watch him stand on the rise in the northeast corner, ears rotating, nose twitching, the city skyline faint in the distance. He stands tall, not because he is captive, but because he is present. Still watching, still adapting, still wild, in all the ways that matter.